What were Galileo's contributions to science and mathematics?
Galileo Galilei, 1564–1642, is credited with establishing the modern method of experimentation. He was the first scientist and thinker to try to prove or disprove theory by conducting tests and observing the results. Prior to Galileo, scientific theory was purely based on hypothesis and conjecture. It was in the interest of conducting accurate tests and in making precise observations that Galileo developed a number of inventions, including the hydrostatic balance, a device designed to measure the density of objects, in about 1586, and the thermometer. One of the first measuring devices used in science, in 1593. The invention most widely credited to Galileo is the telescope. However, he did not originate the instrument, but rather improved it, in 1609. He was also the first to use a telescope to study the skies, which led him to make a series of discoveries. All in 1610, the moon shines with reflected light, the surface of the moon is mountainous. The Milky Way is made up of countless stars, and Jupiter has 4 large satellites. He was even able to correctly estimate the period of rotation of each of these moons, which he named Medicean stars, for his benefactor, Cosimo de' Medici. Galileo was also the first to observe the phases of Venus, which are similar to the moon's, and to discover sunspots. Prior to these astronomical discoveries, Galileo had already made significant contributions to science. In 1589, when he was only 25 years old, he published a treatise on the center of gravity in solids. From 1602 to 1609 he studied the motion of pendulums and other objects along arcs and inclines. From these observations, he concluded that falling objects accelerate at a constant rate. This law of uniform acceleration later helped Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, derive the law of gravity. Galileo also demonstrated that the path of a projectile is a parabola. Galileo was a professor of mathematics at Pisa, 1589 to 1591, and at Padua, 1592–1610, Italy. In 1610 he was appointed philosopher and mathematician. Extraordinary to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo de' Medici.
What was the first big union?
The first national union of note was the Knights of Labor, founded by garment workers in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1869. Recruiting women, blacks, immigrants, and unskilled and semi-skilled workers alike. The Knights of Labor's open membership policy provided the organization with a broad base of support, something previous labor unions, which had limited membership based on craft or skill, lacked. The organization set its objectives on instituting the 8-hour workday, prohibiting child labor under age 14, instituting equal opportunities and wages for women laborers, and abolishing convict labor. the group became involved in numerous strikes from the late 1870s to the mid-1880s. At the same time, a faction of moderates within the organization was growing. And in 1883 it elected American machinist Terence Powderly, 1849 to 1924, as president. Under Powderly's leadership, the Knights of Labor began to splinter. Moderates pursued a conciliatory policy in labor disputes, supporting the establishment of labor bureaus and public arbitration systems. Radicals not only opposed the policy of open membership, they strongly supported strikes as a means of achieving immediate goals, including a one-day general strike to demand implementation of an 8-hour workday. In May 1886, workers demonstrating in Chicago's Haymarket Square attracted a crowd of some 1,500 people. When police arrived to disperse them, a bomb exploded and rioting ensued. 11 people were killed and more than 1,000 were injured in the melee. For many Americans, the event linked the labor movement with anarchy. That same year, several factions of the Knights of Labor seceded from the Union to join the American Federation of Labor, AFL. The Knights of Labor remained intact for 3 more decades, before the organization officially dissolved in 1917. By which time the group had been overshadowed by the AFL and other unions.
What happened to the Visigoths?
When both the Visigoths and Ostrogoths were attacked by the Huns in 370, the Visigoths fared better, many of them fleeing into a Roman province. In 378 the Visigoths rebelled against the Roman authorities. On horseback, they fought the Battle of Adrianople, in present-day Turkey, destroying a Roman army and killing Rome's eastern emperor, Valens, c. 328 to 378. The Visigoths' introduction of the cavalry. Troops trained to fight on horseback. As part of warfare determined European military, social, and political development for the next 1,000 years. After the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths moved into Italy. And under the leadership of their ruler, Alaric, c. 370 to 410, sacked Rome in 410, an event that signaled the beginning of the decline of the Roman Empire. After the success of the Visigoths, one tribe after another invaded the empire. The Visigoths continued westward into Gaul, and there set up a monarchy that consisted of much of France and Spain and was centered in Toulouse. But in 507 they were driven out by the Franks, and the Visigoths withdrew into the Iberian Peninsula, present-day Spain and Portugal. Toledo was established as the capital of the Visigoth kingdom in 534. Roderick, or Rodrigo, the last of the Visigoth kings in Spain, was defeated and killed in 711 during a battle with the Muslims, Moors, who invaded from northern Africa. The Muslims went on to rule most of the Iberian Peninsula until the mid-1400s.
What was the reconstruction?
The Reconstruction was the 12-year period, 1865 to 77, of rebuilding that followed the Civil War. The last battle over, the South lay in ruins, food and other supplies were scarce, people were homeless. City centers had been destroyed, schools were demolished, railways torn up, and government was non-existent. Further, the nation had new citizens to enfranchise and protect the freed slaves. There was also the question of how to readmit each southern state to the Union. In short, the nation's wounds needed to heal. But the long years of the Reconstruction brought only more divisiveness and quarrels. This time the battlefield was not Gettysburg or Chattanooga, but Washington. D.C. President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, a Southern Democrat and former slave owner, squared off with Congress, led by a radical Republican faction. The two branches of government fought over who should guide Reconstruction policy. Johnson favored a more tolerant and swifter approach to reuniting the nation. But his measures failed to protect the country's black citizens. Congress proceeded more cautiously, setting up military administrators in the South as an interim form of government until readmission of the states could be effected. In the end, Congress won out by overriding President Johnson's vetoes again and again. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which took a first step toward enfranchising the black population by guaranteeing the legal rights of former slaves, the Reconstruction Acts, 1867. Outlining how each Southern state would be readmitted to the Union, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, which extended the life of the wartime agency in order to help Southern blacks and whites get back on their feet, and adopted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the so-called Civil War Amendments. Since the South was based on agriculture, the economy slowly recovered, eventually becoming more industrial. Public schools were established in each state, and the state governments became more open than they had been, with more offices up for election rather than appointment. In addition, blacks were guaranteed the vote and the right to run for office. But there was resistance to all these measures, and the post-Civil War recovery was not smooth. Many historians believe that the controversy that ensued in the years that followed the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, April 1865, laid the groundwork for segregation and other injustices that brought on the civil rights movement. Many also believe that the problems are still with the country today.
How were the Gauls related to the Celts?
The ancient Gauls were a Celtic people who spoke forms of the Celtic language. They occupied the ancient country of Gaul, a region west of the Rhine River and north of the Pyrenees Mountains, an area that today consists of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, part of Germany, and part of the Netherlands. The Gauls were led by priests, who were called Druids. By 390 BC the Gauls had moved southward, across the Alps and into Italy. In the 3rd century BC, they battled the powerful Romans and were briefly successful. Ultimately, however, they were defeated, becoming subjects of Rome. Later, under Julius Caesar, the Romans conquered all of Gaul, so that by 50 BC the region became part of the Roman Empire. 5 centuries later, Gaul was overrun by the Franks, for whom the region was named. Thus, French people today are descendants of the Gauls. Also, the Galatians, one of the Christian peoples to whom the Apostle Paul wrote while he was in jail, were descendants of the Gauls who settled in Macedonia and Asia Minor, the peninsula between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, which today is occupied by Turkey.
How was Rome sacked?
After the split of the Roman Empire in 395, the West Roman Empire continued to weaken and Rome became subject to a series of brutal attacks by Germanic tribes. In 410 the Visigoths moved into Italy and looted Rome. In 455 the Vandals thoroughly ravaged the city. Finally, in 476 the city fell when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, 433 to 493, forced Romulus Augustulus, c. 450-, the last ruler of the empire, from the throne. By this time, however, Germanic chiefs had already begun claiming Roman lands and dividing them into several smaller kingdoms. The year 476 marks the official collapse of the West Roman Empire.
What were the effects of the Industrial Revolution?
The dawn of the Industrial Revolution spelled the end of home or workshop-based production. Factories were built to house the new machines, causing a population shift from rural to developing urban areas by the mid-1800s, as people went where the work was. Factory owners turned to child labor, and in the United States, to the steady influx of immigrants to run the machinery in their plants. As industry grew, it required financial institutions that could provide money for expansion, thus giving birth to a new breed of wealthy business leaders, including the extraordinarily prosperous robber barons, the industrial and financial tycoons of the late 19th century. But as industry evolved, government and policy changes did not keep pace. Serious social, political, and economic problems resulted, including poor and often dangerous working conditions, exploitation of workers, including child laborers, overcrowded housing, pollution, corruption, industry monopolies, and a widening gap between the rich and the poor. Change was slow to come, but social activism and government reforms in the late 1800s and during the progressive era of the early 1900s much of which centered around trade unions, alleviated these problems. The rapid development of industry caused sweeping social changes. The Western world, which had long been agriculturally based, became an industrial society where goods and services are the primary focus.
Why was the Medici family important to Renaissance art?
The Medici family was powerful in Florence, Italy, between the 14th and 16th centuries. The founder of the family was Giovanni de' Bici de' Medici, 1360–1429, who amassed a large fortune through his skill in trade and who virtually ruled Florence between 1421 and 1429. Later, Lorenzo de' Medici, 1449–1492, ruled Florence between 1478 and 1492. Though he was tyrannical, he was a great patron of the arts and letters. Lorenzo, also called the Magnificent, maintained Fiesole, a villa outside Florence, where he surrounded himself with the great talents and thinkers of Florence, including a young artist named Sandro Botticelli, 1445–1510. Lorenzo was also a patron of Michelangelo.
Why does controversy surround Christopher Columbus?
It is due in part to the fact that history wrongly billed Columbus, 1451–1506, as the discoverer of the New World. The native peoples living in the Americas before the arrival of Christopher Columbus were the true discoverers of these lands. These peoples had migrated thousands of years before, it is believed that as early as 50,000 BC. They came across the Bering Strait from Asia, and migrated southward, throughout North and South America, reaching Tierra del Fuego by 8000 BC. Therefore, it is correct to say that Columbus was the first European to discover the New World, and there he encountered its native peoples. But it was for his treatment of these native peoples that Columbus is a controversial figure. Columbus was called back from the New World twice, on his second and third voyages, to be investigated for his dealings with the Native Americans, including charges of cruelty. The first inquiry, 1496–97, turned out favorably for the explorer. His case was heard before the Spanish king, and charges were dismissed. However, troublesome rumors continued to follow Columbus, and in 1500 he and two of his brothers, Bartholomew and Diego, were arrested and sent back to Spain in chains. Though later released and allowed to continue his explorations, he would make one final trip to the New World. Christopher Columbus never regained his former stature, lost all honor, and died in poverty in the Spanish city of Valladolid in 1506.
What are the divisions of the Hebrew Bible?
The Hebrew Bible is divided into three main sections called the Law, or Torah, the Prophets, and the Writings, or Hagiographa. The Hebrew Bible is accepted by Jews as sacred. The word testament comes from the ancient word testamentum, meaning covenant with God. Much of the Hebrew Bible recounts Jewish history, demonstrating faithful observance to their agreement with God. The Law consists of those 5 books written by Moses, and these recount creation, early traditions, the lives of the patriarchs of Israel, early events of the Israelites, and entrance into the Promised Land. Torah translates as teaching, and Jews, as do Christians. Look to these first 5 books of the Bible for guidance. The prophets consists of the books of the former prophets, books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, and the latter prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the teachings of 12 other prophets. The books of the prophets chronicle historical events. But according to the Jewish tradition, these books also teach that people must obey God's laws. The writings consist of 13 books, which are believed to have been written by poets and teachers.
Is blues music older than jazz?
Only slightly, and only if your definition of jazz doesn't include ragtime. Really, the two musical traditions developed side by side, with blues emerging about the first decade of the 1900s and hitting the height of its early popularity in 1920s Harlem, where the songs were seen as an expression of African American life. Great blues singers like Ma Rainey, 1886 to 1939, and Bessie Smith, 1894 or 1898 to 1937, sang of the black reality determined but weary. During the Harlem Renaissance, the music was a symbol for African American people who were struggling to be accepted for who they were. Poet Langston Hughes, 1902 to 1967, saw the blues as a distinctly black musical genre, and as helping to free blacks from American standardization. As the first person to codify and publish blues songs, American musician and composer W. C. Handy, 1873 to 1958, is considered the father of the blues. The Florence, Alabama, native produced a number of well-known works, including Memphis Blues, St. Louis Blues, which is one of the most frequently recorded songs in popular music, Bale Street Blues, and Careless Love.
Who was Clara Barton?
The American humanitarian was called the Angel of the Battlefield for her work during the Civil War, 1861 to 65. Clara, Clarissa Harlow, Barton, 1821 to 1912, was a nurse in army camps and on battlefields, where she cared for the wounded. When the fighting ended, Barton formed a bureau to search for missing men. This demanding work left her exhausted. Recuperating in Switzerland in 1869, Barton learned of the newly formed International Red Cross, established 1863. She rallied to the aid of that volunteer organization, tending the needs of those wounded in the fighting of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870–71, which German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, 1815–1898, had provoked in his attempt to create a unified German Empire. In 1877 Barton began working to form the American Red Cross. Her efforts came to fruition in 1881 with the establishment of the first U.S. branch of the International Red Cross. She became the organization's first president, a post she held from 1882 to 1904. When Johnstown, Pennsylvania, experienced a devastating flood in 1889, Barton took charge of relief work there. She subsequently advocated a clause be added to the Red Cross Constitution, stating that the organization would also provide relief during calamities other than war. She was successful. It is because of Barton that the Red Cross has become a familiar and welcome sight in times of disaster.
Who was Montezuma?
Montezuma, or Moctezuma, was the name of two rulers of the Aztec Indians in Mexico. Montezuma I ruled an area that extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific. He is credited with enlarging Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, which is today Mexico City. He died in 1469, but 3 years earlier was succeeded by his nephew, Montezuma II, 1466–1520. Who is the Montezuma most people are familiar with, since it was during his reign that the Aztecs came into contact with and were eventually conquered by the Spaniards under explorer Hernán Cortés, 1485–1547. In 1519 Montezuma tried to persuade Cortés not to come to Mexico City, but Cortés and his troops marched inland anyway. The Aztecs rose up to fight the Spaniards, but Montezuma was wounded as he addressed his warriors. He died a few days later, on June 30, 1520, 1 year before Mexico City fell to the Spaniards.
Who were the Minutemen?
They were volunteer soldiers, ready to take up arms at a minute's notice, who fought for the American colonies against the British during the Revolutionary War. The Minutemen, who were trained and organized into the militia, are most well known for the battles at Lexington and Concord, on April 19, 1775, which marked the beginning of the war. They had been alerted to the approach of the British troops, or Redcoats, by the patriot Paul Revere, 1735–1818. After the fighting at Lexington and Concord, which left 250 British killed or wounded and about 90 Americans dead. Word spread quickly of the fighting, and the Revolutionary War had begun.
What were the deadliest volcanic eruptions in history?
The April 5, 1815, eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia was the deadliest yet, killing some 92,000 people. Another Indonesian eruption later in the 19th century, this time at Krakatau, claimed 36,417 lives in late August 1883. On the French island of Martinique in the West Indies. Mount Pelee erupted on August 30, 1902, and more than 29,000 people perished. A relatively recent and deadly eruption was that on November 13, 1985, at Nevada del Ruiz, Colombia. It claimed 23,000 lives. Iceland's Skaptur volcano erupted in 1783. While the number of lives lost may not qualify it for inclusion on a short list of deadliest volcanoes, the human toll was great indeed. 20% of the country's population died. Because of population growth, today more people live closer to volcanoes, both active and inactive. As a result, the number of volcano-related deaths has increased. Between the years 1600 and 1900, the estimated average death toll per year due to volcanoes was 315. Since the beginning of the 20th century, an average of 845 people have died each year because of volcanic eruptions.
What are the four horsemen of the apocalypse?
The four horsemen of the apocalypse are allegorical figures mentioned in chapter 6 of Revelation, also called the Revelation of St. John the Divine. The chapter describes a scroll which contains 7 seals and is held in God's right hand. When the first 4 of the seals are opened, the 4 horsemen appear, each on a different colored horse. There are various interpretations of these allegorical figures, but the rider on the white horse is believed to represent conquest, or the return of Christ. The rider on the red horse is believed to represent war. The rider on the black horse, famine, and the pale horse, death. Some believe these hardships to be signs of the end of the world. The symbol of the 4 horsemen has appeared throughout art and literature.
What is habeas corpus?
The writ of habeas corpus, which is roughly translated from the Latin as "you should have the body," is considered a cornerstone of due process of law. It means that a person cannot be detained unless he or she is brought in person before the court, so the court can determine whether or not the person is being lawfully held. The notion dates back to medieval England. Many historians believe that habeas corpus was implied by the Magna Carta. 1215, Article 39 states, no freeman shall be taken or imprisoned, or exiled, or in any way destroyed, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. The writ was reinforced by Britain's Habeas Corpus Amendment Act of 1679, which stated that the Crown, King or Queen, cannot detain a prisoner against the wishes of Parliament and the courts. The English introduced the concept in the American colonies. And when the U.S. Constitution 1788 was written, it declared, in Article I, Section 9, that habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. For example, during the Civil War, 1861–65, President Abraham Lincoln 1809–1865, suspended habeas corpus, and during Reconstruction, 1865–77. It was again suspended in an effort to combat the activities of the Ku Klux Klan.
What was the impact of the accident at 3 Mile Island?
Prior to the March 1979 events at 3 Mile Island, it was thought that the danger of a nuclear meltdown was almost negligible. Though there were safety systems in place, none of them would have prevented a complete catastrophe. Since the accident, the American Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, and utility companies have worked together to resolve the problems that were revealed. Among the efforts and requirements put into place were, more stringent licensing procedures for operators, better training of plant operators in the event of an emergency, wider sharing of information on emergency management systems, effort to locate new plants outside of densely populated areas, more rigid quality assurance standards at all plants, strict implementation of the standards, which are subject to review by the NRC, and emergency evacuation plans that must be approved by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Even with these improvements to safety programs, the accident at Chernobyl in 1986 again produced worldwide concern over the hazards of nuclear power.
What are Islam's 5 pillars of faith?
Muslims practice adherence to the 5 pillars of faith. 1. Belief in Allah as the only God and Muhammad as his prophet. 2. Prayer 5 times daily at dawn, at noon, in the afternoon, in the evening, and at nightfall. 3. Giving alms to the poor. 4. Fasting from dawn until dusk during the holy month of Ramadan. And 5. Making the pilgrimage, Hajj, to the holy city of Mecca at least once during their lifetime.
Why did people first believe that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah?
In his lifetime, Jesus of Nazareth, c. 6b.cc AD 30, was believed to be the Messiah for many reasons. These reasons are explained in detail in the New Testament, particularly in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. First, Jesus was thought to have been miraculously conceived by Mary, a virgin. In Luke 2:8-20, an angel is described as having spoken to shepherds tending their fields, telling them that in this night in the city of David, a Savior is born unto you, a Messiah, the Lord. And goes on to say that the sign of the Messiah is that they will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes. Also in Luke 2:36-38, a prophetess arrives and proclaims Mary's baby to be the child to all who were looking for the liberation of the Jews. Further, Jesus proclaimed himself to be the Son of God, as described, for example, in John 5:17-23. He demonstrated extraordinary healing powers, used parables to teach moral and spiritual ways, and carried a message of God's redeeming love. All of this was convincing enough that many, mostly the common people, became disciples or followers of Christ during his lifetime.
How old was Mozart when he composed his first work?
A child prodigy, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, 1756-1791, was composing at the age of 5. He had been playing the harpsichord since the age of 3. His father, Leopold, 1719-1787, was a composer and violinist who recognized his son's unusual music ability and encouraged and taught young Mozart. In 1762 Leopold took his son and daughter, Maria Anna, nicknamed Nannerl, 1751-1829, on tour to Paris. While there, young Wolfgang Mozart composed his first published violin sonatas and improvisations. However, the image of the effortless and artless child of nature is not altogether true. Contrary to the reports that the gifted composer never revised first and only drafts, he did work at his craft. In a letter to his father, he wrote, "It is a mistake to think that the practice of my art has become easy to me. No one has given so much care to the study of composition as I have. There is scarcely a famous master in music whose works I have not frequently and diligently studied." The fact is that he did make revisions to his works, though it is also true that he composed at a rapid pace. The result is an impressive body of works, unequaled in beauty and diversity. The complete output, some 600 works in every form: symphonies, sonatas, operas, operettas, cantatas, arias, duets, and others, would be enough to fill almost 200 CDs. Among his most cherished works are The Marriage of Figaro, 1786, Don Giovanni, 1787, Così fan tutte, 1790, and The Magic Flute, 1791.
What did Freud believe?
The Austrian neurologist believed that human behavior and all mental states are influenced by repressed and forgotten impressions, many of them from childhood. Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, further believed that by uncovering these impressions, collectively called a complex, he could effect a cure for his patient. Freud regarded infantile mental processes, including infantile sexuality, of particular importance to the unconscious, and therefore influential to human behavior. While he initially used hypnosis, a sleep-like state in which the patient is open to suggestion, as a method of revealing the unconscious, Freud later turned to a new form of treatment called free association. By this method, a patient talks about whatever is on his or her mind, jumping from one idea to the next. The memories and feelings that surface through free association are then analyzed by the therapist to find the root of the patient's mental or emotional problem. Freud also interpreted his patient's dreams, which he believed are unconscious representations of repressed desires. Free association and dream analysis are the cornerstones of psychoanalysis. In analyzing human behavior, Freud came to the conclusion that the mind, or psyche, is divided into three parts: the ID, the ego, and the superego. The ID is the source of instincts, the ego is the mediator between those instincts and reality, and the superego is the conscience. The superego functions to reward or punish through a system of moral attitudes and a sense of guilt. The theories of psychoanalysis hold that if the parts of the mind oppose each other, a mental or emotional disorder, called a neurosis, occurs. Freud's theories revolutionized the fields of psychiatry and psychology. They also influenced methods and philosophies of child rearing and education. While psychoanalysis has been credited with helping millions of mentally ill patients, Freud's theories have also been rejected or challenged by many.
How was the United Nations formed?
Officially, the United Nations, UN, was not formed until October 1945. However, events during World War II, 1939–45, had paved the way for the founding of the international peacekeeping organization that today is so familiar to people around the globe. Fervent German nationalist Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945, and his troops invaded Poland in 1939. And soon Nazi Germany had conquered much of Europe. Leaders of 9 nations: Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Yugoslavia met with Britain and its Commonwealth states in London. There, on June 12, 1941, the countries signed the Inter-Allied Declaration, vowing to work together for a free world. 2 months later, on August 14, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt 1882 to 1945, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, 1874 to 1965, signed the Atlantic Charter. In it the two leaders outlined their aims for peace. On January 1, 1942, the declaration by the United Nations was signed by 26 countries who pledged to work together to fight the Axis powers. Germany, Italy, and Japan, and they agreed not to make peace separately. The term United Nations, otherwise known as the UN, is believed to have originated with Roosevelt. In late November and early December 1943, the Big Three Roosevelt, Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, 1879 to 1953, met in Tehran, Iran, for the first time during the war. There these Allied nations leaders cited the responsibility of a United Nations organization in keeping the peace once the war was over. Though ending the war was first and foremost in the minds of these leaders. All had seen two world wars fought in close succession and were determined that the nations of the world could work together to prevent such an event from happening again. In August 1944, at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in Washington, D.C., representatives of Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China met to make plans for the peacekeeping organization that had been envisioned. The outcome of that meeting, which lasted into October, was the basic concept for the UN Security Council as we know it, with the world's 5 major powers having permanent seats on the council and a limited and rotating membership beyond that. When the Big Three met again at the Yalta Conference, in the Soviet Union, in February 1945, they discussed matters that were central to ending the fighting with Germany and with Japan. But Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin also announced that a conference of the United Nations would open in San Francisco on April 25 of that year. Having directed the United States' massive war effort, Roosevelt did not live to see the end of World War II or the creation of the international peacekeeping body. Roosevelt died suddenly on April 12, 1945. The war in Europe ended May 7. And during the closing days of World War II, the UN was chartered. The representatives of the Allied nations met as promised in San Francisco. On June 26, 1945, the governing treaty was signed by the delegates. On October 24, 1945, shortly after the war ended with Japan, the United Nations officially came into existence when the required number of nations approved the charter. 50 nations were members of the UN at the outset. Today the membership numbers 191.
Why is the Cathedral of Notre Dame famous?
The Paris Cathedral was built using the first true flying buttresses, masonry bridges that transmit the thrust of a vault or a roof to an outer support. The device allowed the structure to achieve a great height, one of the first Gothic churches to do so. Gothic was a medieval architectural style that predominated in Northern Europe from the early 12th century until the 16th century, it was epitomized in elaborate churches with stained glass windows ornamentation meant to instill the building itself with transcendental qualities. One of the leading examples of Gothic architecture is the Amiens Cathedral. In Amiens, northern France, which was begun in 1220. Its soaring nave, the central area of a church, epitomizes the era's drive for height. The Amiens Cathedral is France's largest.
Is bluegrass music a distinctly American genre?
Yes, the style of music developed out of country music during the late 1930s and throughout the 1940s. Bill Monroe, 1911 to 1996, a country and bluegrass singer-songwriter, altered the tempo, key, pitch, and instrumentation of traditional country music to create a new style named for the band that originated it. Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. Monroe's home state was Kentucky. Bluegrass was first heard by a wide audience when in October 1939. Monroe and his band appeared on the popular country music radio program The Grand Ole Opry. Although bluegrass evolved through several stages and involved a host of contributors, through it all Bill Monroe remained the guiding and inspirational force, and therefore merits the distinction of being the father of bluegrass.
What are blue laws?
The term blue laws refers to laws that are intended to enforce moral conduct. They originated in colonial times in Puritan New England, and got the name because they were printed on blue paper. Some blue laws prescribed proper conduct for the Sabbath, which included no working, sports, or drinking. The early blue laws of New Haven, Connecticut, were widely publicized in a 1781 book, A General History of Connecticut. The author, Samuel Peters, 1735-1826, took some freedoms with the text. However, and even invented a few laws of his own. Since blue laws violate individual freedoms, most of them have been repealed through the years. If a community still has blue laws on its books today, they are not likely to be enforced. James Iredell. Jay's was an impressive resume by the time of his appointment. He had been a member of the Continental Congress, over which he presided as president in 1778 and 1779, served as U.S. Minister to Spain. 1779, during the American Revolution, and joined American statesman Benjamin Franklin. 1706 to 1790, and the rest of the American Peace Commission in Paris, in 1782, to draw up the treaty ending the war with Britain. Once the new republic was established, Jay remained at the fore. He became President Washington's Secretary of Foreign Affairs, 1784 to 89, and, along with Alexander Hamilton, 1755 to 1804, and James Madison, 1751 to 1836, authored The Federalist, 1787 to 88. Which explained the Constitution for the benefit of the states as they considered ratification.
What are the Dead Sea Scrolls?
The scrolls are ancient manuscripts of great historical and religious importance. They were found in dry riverbed caves on the northwestern side of the Dead Sea, a salt lake situated between Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan. More than 800 scrolls have been found, with the most famous discoveries made in 1947. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found miles apart at a number of different sites, including Khirbet Qumran in the West Bank, formerly Israel. The texts date to different centuries but include fragments of every book of the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, except the Book of Esther. Some texts are almost identical to Bible texts used today, showing that much of the Old Testament is the same as it was 2,000 years ago.
Who was the first to go around the world?
YC, the first to circumnavigate the globe was the Basque navigator Juan Sebastián de Elcano, c. 1476 to 1526, though 18 sailors who made the trip with him also claim the distinction. The trip was completed in 1522 and had taken nearly 3 years. In 1519, Elcano had set out with Ferdinand Magellan, c. 1480 to 1521, on a Spanish-sponsored expedition that became the first one successful in finding a western route to the east, having rounded the southernmost point of mainland South America. In 1520, and entering into the South Pacific, the expedition reached the Philippines in 1521. When Magellan was killed there, it was Elcano who took leadership of the crew and guided the expedition westward, returning to Spain as the first sea captain to go around the world.
What were indentured servants?
During colonial times in America, there were two kinds of indentured servants, voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary servants were people, often trained in a craft or skill, who could not afford passage to the colonies. In exchange for their passage, they agreed to work for a period of 4 to 7 years for a colonial master. At the end of this period, the servant became a freeman and was usually granted land, tools, or money by the former master. Involuntary indentured servants were criminals whose sentence was a period of servitude. The impoverished, or those in debt. Most indentured servants were involuntary. Their period of obligation to a colonial master was longer than that of a voluntary servant, usually 7 to 14 years. But, like their counterparts, the involuntary servants also received land, tools, or money at the end of their contract, and they, too, became freemen. The arrival of indentured servants in the American colonies addressed a labor shortage that emerged in the early 1600s. In 1618 the Virginia Company, a joint stock enterprise that encouraged the development of Virginia, adopted a new charter based on the head right system. Englishmen who could pay their own Atlantic crossing were granted 50 acres of land. Each of their sons and servants were also granted an additional 50 acres. Other colonies were also developed under the head right system, with the land amounts varying by colony. Soon there were more farms than there was labor to work the fields. The colonists solved this problem through the system of indentured servitude. Many indentured servants were drawn from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Germany. In European ports, people contracted themselves or became involuntarily contracted to ship captains, who transported them to the colonies, where their contracts were sold to the highest bidder. Roughly half the colonial immigrants were indentured servants. Colonial laws ensured servants would fulfill the term of their obligation. Any servant who ran away was severely punished. Laws also protected the servants, whose masters were obligated to provide them with housing, food, medical care, and even religious training. The system was prevalent in the mid-Atlantic colonies, but it was also used in the South. When the economies of the Caribbean islands failed at the end of the 1600s, plantation owners sold their slaves to the mainland, where they worked primarily on southern plantations, replacing indentured servants by about 1700. In other colonies, the system ended with the American Revolution, 1775 to 83.
When was the first alphabet created?
The earliest form of an alphabet, a set of letters with which one or more languages are written, was developed between 1800 and 1000 B.C. by a Semitic people of unknown identity. In 1928 in the northern Syrian city of Ras Shamra, clay tablets were discovered with a cuneiform, wedge-shaped, alphabet of characters. According to most scholars, these early Semitic inventors got the idea of developing an alphabet because of their contact with Egyptian hieroglyphics. Although some of the Semitic symbols were Egyptian, the system of writing was distinctly their own, consisting of 22 characters representing only consonants. There were no written directions for vowels. The reader had to supply the vowels from his or her knowledge of the language. The characters were developed this way. Important Semitic words were selected so that each would begin with a different consonant. Then, stylized pictures portraying the words, mostly nouns, were assigned the phonetic value of the initial sound of each word. For example, the first character in the Semitic Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, originally meant and was the symbol for an ox head. The second, Beth, which came to represent the sound B, meant house, and renderings of the symbol reveal a shelter with a roof. The Phoenician alphabet, developed c. 1000 BC, is believed to have been derived from this early Semitic alphabet. In turn, the Greeks, in about 500 BC, adapted the Phoenician alphabet for their own use.
Why is Titian thought of as the father of modern painting?
During Titian's time, 1488 or 1490 to 1576, artists began painting on canvas rather than on wood panels. A master of color, the Venetian painter was both popular and prolific. His work was so sought after that even with the help of numerous assistants, he could not keep up with demand. His body of works established oil color on canvas as the typical medium of Western pictorial tradition. Among his most well-known paintings are Sacred and Profane Love, c. 1515, and Venus of Urbino, 1538.
What was the Act of Settlement?
The 1701 decree reiterated the Bill of Rights of 1689 by stating that the king or queen of England must not be a Roman Catholic and must also not be married to a Roman Catholic. The Act of Settlement further stipulated that the sovereign must be a member of the Protestant Church of England. The measure was passed by Parliament, in part due to fear of the Jacobites. Supporters of the Stuart king, James II, 1633 to 1701, who had been exiled in 1688 in the Glorious Revolution. The Jacobites, not to be confused with the French Jacobins. The political party that came to power during the French Revolution, sought to keep the House of Stuart in power. Due to the line of succession, however, the Act of Settlement did not take effect until 1714, when Queen Anne 1665 to 1714, died and left no successors to the throne. She was the last Stuart ruler of England.
What was Black Tuesday?
It was the day the stock market crashed Tuesday, October 29, 1929, signaling the beginning of the worldwide economic downturn called the Great Depression, 1929-39. On Thursday, October 24, 1929, stock values declined rapidly following a 5-year period in which the average price of common stocks on the New York Stock Exchange had more than doubled. The prosperity of the 1920s and the widespread sale and purchase of Liberty bonds, U.S. government bonds, to help finance World War I, 1914-18, had encouraged many Americans to invest in the stock market. With the market robust, timing seemed right for speculation and America's Experience with Liberty bonds had made many people comfortable with and interested in investments. So when the stock market dropped precipitously on that fateful October day in 1929, the effects were felt by many. On the following Monday, prices again plummeted. On Tuesday, October 29, stockholders panicked, selling off more than 16.4 million shares, and prices nosedived. Institutions were also affected, banks, also investors, lost huge sums of money, forcing many to close their doors. News of the stock market failure and bank closures caused many Americans to try to withdraw their money from their deposit accounts, leading to the famous run on the banks. The late October financial crises marked the beginning of a decade of hard times.
President, how long must women wait for liberty?
And, more radically, Kaiser Wilson, 20 million American women are not self-governed. Their intent was to expose the government's hypocrisy. In April, the United States had entered World War I. 1914-18, in an effort to guarantee democracy abroad. Yet democracy did not exist at home, where the entire female population remained disenfranchised. In June, police began arresting demonstrators on minor charges, such as obstructing traffic. But the arrests did nothing to deter the suffragists. Upon their release from prison, they returned to protest at the White House gates. In all, 168 women, including Alice Paul, 1885 to 1977, and Lucy Burns, 1879 to 1966, of the National Woman's Party, were arrested. On the night of November 14, 1917, guards took 33 protesters to the Occoquan workhouse to be held. Previously, the women had been subject to forced feedings and solitary confinement at Occoquan. But this time new cruelties awaited them. They were beaten, dragged, choked, and handcuffed. Word leaked out about the atrocities committed at the workhouse. Less than 2 weeks later, a judge ruled that the women had been brutally treated. Yet they had done nothing more than exercise their constitutional right to free speech. The women returned to their fight, now with more weight of public opinion behind them. Nevertheless, it was 3 long years before the 19th Amendment was adopted, guaranteeing women the right to vote. In 1982, a historical marker was placed on the prison grounds in tribute to the brave women who endured Occoquan's night of terror.
What was the League of Nations?
The League of Nations was the forerunner to the United Nations. It was an international organization established by the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, 1914-18. Since the United States never ratified that treaty, it was not a member. The League was set up to handle disputes among countries and to avoid another major conflict such as the Great War, which is how World War I was referred to until the outbreak of World War II. But the organization proved to be ineffective. It was unable to intervene in such acts of aggression as Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Italy's conquest of Ethiopia during 1935 to 1936, and occupation of Albania in 1939, and Germany's takeover of Austria in 1938. The League of Nations dissolved itself during World War II, 1939-45. Though unsuccessful, the organization did establish a basic model for a permanent international organization.
What was Goethe's contribution to world literature?
Johann Wolfgang Goethe, 1749-1832, is considered Germany's greatest writer. He also was a scientist, artist, musician, and philosopher. As a writer, Goethe experimented with many genres and literary styles, and his works became a shaping force of the major German literary movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. His masterwork, the poetic drama Faust, 1808, rewritten 1832, embodies the author's humanistic ideal of a world literature, one that transcends the boundaries of nations and historical periods. Indeed, the story of Faust, a German astrologer, magician, and soothsayer, c. 1480-1540, remains one of universal interest, and has been treated often in both literature and music. The legendary figure was believed to have sold his soul to the devil in exchange for the opportunity to experience all of life's pleasures.